Filling the Harm Reduction Gap, featuring Sheila Vakharia. What happens when there's a substantial gap in how we currently approach substance use? Sheila Vakharia is an author, sought-after speaker, and national expert on harm reduction and drug policy. Her recent book, The Harm Reduction Gap, provides an educational and thought-provoking review of the current approach to drug use and how harm reduction is a safety net that keeps people alive. Listen as she discusses the reasons for writing the book, meeting readers where they are when it comes to harm reduction, how systems are designed to harm, and how we can begin to undo it at pivotal touchpoints. Our featured guest for this episode is Sheila Vakharia, and she is the Deputy Director of Research and Academic Engagement at the Drug Policy Alliance. In this role, she helps DPA staff and others understand a range of drug policy issues. Dr. Vakharia builds relationships with drug researchers and helps to advance policy-relevant research. She also mobilizes researchers in support of DPA policy campaigns and organizes conferences on key issues in drug policy. Dr. Vakharia is also the author of The Harm Reduction Gap, helping individuals left behind by conventional drug prevention and abstinence-only treatment. Before joining DPA, Dr. Vakharia was an assistant professor of social work at Long Island University. She has also worked as a clinical social worker in both abstinence-only and harm reduction settings. You can learn more about what she does and find the links to connect with her and a place to find her book at our description in the podcast episode.
This is Talking Addiction and Recovery, the podcast talking, you guessed it, all about addiction and recovery. Join your host, licensed professional counselor Andrew J. Schreier, as he and his guests break down recovery topics with raw honesty, delving into niche conversations around the topics of substance abuse, mental health, and gambling. We intend to meet individuals where they are on their own personal journey of recovery, with dignity, respect, and compassion. We'll do more than talk addiction and recovery. We'll explore it. We're glad you've joined us. Here with today's episode, your host, Andrew Schreier.
All right, welcome Sheila Vakharia to Talking Addiction and Recovery podcast. I'm really excited to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so before we dive into your book, The Harm Reduction Gap, is there a little bit of a background you can give the audience of, what you do?
Yeah, so my current full-time job is working for an organization called the Drug Policy Alliance. It's the nation's leading advocacy organization fighting to end the war on drugs. However, I work in the Department of Research and Academic Engagement, where I don't do any of the policy advocacy work myself. I don't go out talking to legislators. I'm not writing bills or anything like that. In our department, we actually support our colleagues who do the policy advocacy by ensuring they have access to the best available research and evidence as it relates to DPA's policy agenda, and that they're able to speak to the latest research and integrate that into their advocacy campaigns. And so I've been the Deputy Director of the Department of Research and Academic Engagement for several years now, and I've been a DPA for almost 7 years.
And the work at DPA, I found out about it because of people I know who do harm reduction or support harm reduction. They gave that name a lot, and then following the website, social media, there is a lot of connection with the work of harm reduction.
Right. Yeah. DPA was at the forefront of really supporting a lot of efforts to expand legal access to syringe exchange and syringe service programs. We've also done a lot of work around Good Samaritan laws and reducing barriers to calling 911 during overdose. We've supported efforts to expand access to naloxone. And we've also been most recently working on campaigns to expand access to overdose prevention centers.
Yeah, all amazing stuff. And that's really, we get into your book, which it's, fresh off the press and release. It probably seems like it's been out for a little bit longer than it has been. And I know a lot of people were looking forward to reading it. And I will say I was a fan right out the gate because your first part of it really the introduction, you talk about the importance of language. And I've been doing some presenting on like how we speak matters, undoing stigmatizing language. So when I read your book and I'm like, oh my goodness, the first part is about language. What made you choose that as sort of, before I really get into the content of the book, what had you thinking that that was so important to put at the beginning?
I think that when it comes to drugs and drug policy and addiction, that there are some deeply entrenched terms and terminologies that are part of how we talk about the work and the people who are impacted by these issues. And I believe that over time, the norms and the terminologies have shifted due to a greater awareness that perhaps some of how we used to talk about these issues actually affirmed or created stigma. And I think that as we as a society become more aware of the importance of language, and particularly person first language, writing a book that I like to think of as kind of a primer to harm reduction at this current moment, I wanted to do some level setting, I think, about language so that people knew what to expect and what they were or maybe were not going to see when they read my book.
And you really sort of met people where they were with encouraging people to think about the language they use, why they use it, meaning behind it. You explained the words you're going to choose to use and all that. So I felt it was also very much encouraging readers to, it wasn't like well, don't do this. No, 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 stop, stop, stop. It was sort of more of like a language is important. It carries weight. This is the implications it can have. And you sort of opened that up for people to have, I would say, a curiosity to realize that a topic like this, like language, can carry really heavy weight, from policies to procedure, to all these things that we do. Language plays a really big role in it.
Yeah. And I also wanted to introduce like a time capsule element to it as well, that I wrote this book between 2021, 2022, and 2023 at a moment where these are the terms that I feel comfortable using, the people I'm in community with use these terms, and that perhaps also the reader in the future may already be living in a world where we've moved into another set of terminology as well. So I also wanted to let people know that this is how I'm thinking and talking about it now. And as I talk about in the book, that my own opinions and thoughts have evolved over time, I also think that in introducing the terms that I was using at this moment, I was also building in the acknowledgement that I myself may not even use these terms in the future, and that's okay for us to change.
Yeah, it was really great. I'm a fan of this already, but just with how that is starting. And the title, can we talk about the harm reduction gap and in choosing that title? Because a couple of things that as I read it, that was a really great way of how I was, taking the information in and kind of looking at it. Where did the title for the harm reduction gap really come from?
I knew I wanted to write a book about harm reduction, but I didn't want to write a book about harm reduction that was speaking to the choir or that was talking to people who already know and understand and practice harm reduction and live harm reduction in their day-to-day work. So I had to think about, how can I, first of all, even just more broadly in thinking through how I was going to write a book about harm reduction for non-harm reductionists, how was I going to situate harm reduction within the broader continuum of care, within the context of drugs in the United States today, and how we think and talk about it as a society, how we intervene, how we address it, how we prevent the onset of drug use or problematic drug use, how we treat problematic drug use or substance use disorders. Like, I had to think, someone who isn't familiar with harm reduction and may have some questions about it, how would I help them understand where harm reduction fits in? How would I help them see harm reduction as part of a broader continuum, not apart from a continuum? How do I present it as part of a continuum, and it being a both and conversation and not an either or conversation, which I often find people have misconceptions about when they hear that I'm a harm reduction advocate or a harm reductionist, that I'm somehow in opposition to something else. or I'm against something else. And I wanted people to see harm reduction as part of how we can be addressing substance use in our society. And if we can actually think about our continuum of care as maybe requiring harm reduction to actually adequately meet the needs of our communities, maybe presenting a gap is a way to do that.
Yeah, it was amazing as I was first thinking about harm reduction. I think of gaps in the sense of where we don't have it or where it's where we try to put it in and we face pushback or someone might not want it. But then I was also, as I was reading your book and how you really describe it and talk about it, was also that when other areas, aren't serving people or helping people, harm reduction often fills in that gap. So it's also here is where harm reduction is lacking, where there's a gap, but also when other services or traditional ways have gaps, harm reduction has been there to support and help people in that moment. So it was always intriguing as you were talking about that. I kept like seeing like this gap fall and what wasn't there or what was there, and then sort of like what filled in the gap and helped with that. So it was a really amazing way to describe what you were trying to for your audience.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And it took a lot of thinking for me to wrap my own head around how I was going to frame things. Because again, I think I also wanted to introduce harm reduction in a way that didn't feel threatening or imposing or negating the benefits of some of the other aspects of our continuum of care either.
And with the way you did this, and I've found this fascinating as I would read through and how you would describe things. And I think in particular when you were talking about in one part stimulants and why someone might be using stimulants under certain conditions. We talk about this in therapy a lot. This is maybe like treatment lingo, but we talk about play the tape and we kind of talk about, think this through and kind of what goes on. As I read your story or in your book about harm reduction, so often we talk about here's this happens, here's a consequence, or if we do this happens. But you really walked us through, like, when we don't have harm reduction, let's play this out and see what happens. Or when we have this, let's like think this through. And I almost thought that was challenging, individuals, people in certain positions to think beyond more of when we don't have this, let me play out what goes on. And in my mind, there was sort of like this animated video that as I was reading, seeing sort of like this play out, which I think most people don't think about with harm reduction. They don't necessarily see when this happens or when this service isn't available, how these things work out. You talk about that with, syringe service programs. You talked about it with, safe injection sites. You're talking about like how this plays out and how it impacts things. I feel like that's very hard to get people to that point, but your book really illustrated that incredibly well.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think that treatment is a black box for a lot of people. We imagine when we send someone away to treatment, magical things happen, transformative processes happen, people come in one way and then they emerge fixed, transformed, or rehabilitated, or returning back to a prior state, or turning into a different state than when they started. And in the same way, I think people have other kind of black box ideas of what happens in harm reduction settings. And unfortunately, oftentimes people think of harm reduction places or spaces as being places where people stagnate or are just kept barely alive. And I wanted to actually paint a picture of how harm reduction spaces are such important lifelines. They are safety nets. They are places to catch you when you fall. They are places where someone always wants to see you. Someone's always there to welcome you. Where if you don't show up, someone's going to come out looking for you and wondering where you are. I wanted to talk about how lonely it is, how isolating it is, how disconnecting it can be in our communities when people have nowhere to turn because the places where they're told that they should turn to don't want them there because they can't meet them where they're at. And so for me, it was really important to play the tape, as you're saying, of what happens to people who fall through the cracks, what happens to people who get turned away, what happens to people who are deterred from seeking the few options they're told that they have in the community, um, and where harm reduction can be um, that place for people, if that makes sense.
And I really believe that if we give this to someone who doesn't have a lot of knowledge of it or they have different views of it, the way you illustrate that is you're in ways you're sort of like, okay, if we don't do this, like let's talk about what happens then or what goes on, versus like a simple, well, if they don't do it, then if we don't have this, then well, hopefully they'll just change or hopefully they'll just get, that tough love approach that doesn't work. But you sort of say, okay, if we go with this route, let's talk about what does happen or what will happen. And I think that's just a much better approach to getting people to see how that plays out versus sort of stopping the tape and being, like you said, stagnant or just kind of like paused in that moment and don't really think about how that goes. So I really
Yeah.
appreciate that approach you had in explaining that type of how this works and goes forward.
Thank you. Thank you. It was very much a choice that I felt like I had to make because I do think that the average person who hasn't engaged with the treatment system, the average person who's never connected with the harm reduction program, the average person who hasn't been turned away, discharged, dismissed, shamed, blamed, guilted away from seeking help, doesn't really understand what it's like for folks who are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a part that I wanted to ask you, when we talk about harm reduction, there's ways that we can talk about it and reference it that people they have a hard time arguing. It's like everyday life stuff, like seatbelts, fire extinguishers. I don't really have someone that says, well, no, we shouldn't have that. I talk also about a lot of mental health work is harm reduction. We just don't use that language. But
Yeah.
in mental health, we're not trying to get someone abstinent from their symptoms that they no longer have those. We just work on maintaining, like a well-being, and sometimes it becomes safety planning, but there is no, expectation of, well, you no longer have this, but we don't usually use that language. What I find is it's sometimes more about when we talk about substances and harm reduction, or another area might be when we talk about gambling and harm reduction, because there's still a lot of abstinence-based beliefs into gambling treatment or gambling prevention. So part of me is it harm reduction or is it the substances that people have the harder time with? So I'm curious to know your thoughts on how we approach that, because sometimes you can talk about harm reduction in everyday life ways and people they do it like I haven't found someone who's like, well, I don't do any harm reduction ever in my life. Like, life is risky. You do things to prevent harm. We talk about drugs, people then tend to have a harder time understanding it.
I think the only other behavior that I would say that is it's so much clearly also illustrated in is sexual behavior. So I think that, it is something about drugs, but I'd also say there's something about sex.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so perhaps it's more about certain kinds of categories of human behaviors that through policies, culture, social norms have been um, uh, difficult for communities to navigate, right? So, and I talk about, like, for instance, in my chapter 2, how I believe that the war on drugs created the harm reduction gap for people who use certain drugs over others.
Right.
Um, and I believe that um, there is such a clear distinction in how we're willing to think and talk about people who engage in substance use from other kinds of behaviors that we may think that people are less at fault for experiencing or engaging in. And I think that sexuality is one of those areas too, where like social norms and taboos were first built around reducing unwanted pregnancy, perhaps, for guaranteeing like paternity and then rights to property and wealth, if you think about it, and those kinds of things. But I would think that, yeah, I mean, harm reduction had to emerge from behaviors that don't fall cleanly into this category of much more easily being absolved from guilt or blame for not being able to, to navigate, or like, that people might that abstinence may be unrealistic for some people. I don't know if that makes sense, but I haven't thought this part through. I'm sorry.
No, but it you do highlight, it's like a taboo topic, and it's one that is definitely hits people different than other everyday stuff. And now you're kind of challenging people's beliefs, their views about it, things that they may have been talked to or told growing up, and they've thought this way for a while. Like it is a substance, or it is a behavior, but also there's a lot more that is tied to those than some of the everyday things that people don't have as much into it. So that's why we see people get, very defensive or reactive to some of these very issues when you talk about them.
Yeah. And so, in my chapter two, I talk about how, the roots of harm reduction as a broader movement really has to, we trace it back to the emergence of HIV and hepatitis B among, communities who injected drugs specifically, but then also HIV and particularly among queer communities, gay men and trans women. And so, it was at the nexus at that time in the 80s and 90s of extreme institutional and societal and policy level homophobia, heterosexism, transphobia, but also the war on drugs, criminalizing and deciding that certain people who use drugs were disposable and their lives didn't matter. And ensuring that they had access to tools to stay safe and keep themselves safe was not going to be a priority because it so-called sent the wrong message, right? And queer communities who violated norms of who deserves love, what love looks like, what sexuality looks like, who deserves to live authentically, also were kind of really being challenged. So, that's kind of when I connect the dots in terms of really the origins of harm reduction as we know it now, beyond just the interventions, but really talking about it as a social movement driven by people who were marginalized, criminalized, and seen as disposable, who decided to save their own lives.
Yeah, chapter 2, the whole, the war on drugs and how it created it. I mean, it really highlighted historical, structural, societal, economics, everything that sort of has gone into this. I'm really curious to know your thought on this, because I was watching there's a newer documentary released about the troubled teen industry. Now, a whole other topic on harm reduction, to talk about, teens and some of these programs. But it was fascinating where one of them talked about it was really hard for a parent to kind of realize that they got conned or they got suckered into sending someone to a program, that they were wrong. And I was thinking about that in relation to this, that, with like the war on drugs, there was a lot of people involved. There's a lot of money invested into it. There was a lot of years of it. How much of trying to change that is somewhat challenging, because it's not easy for some people to be like, yeah, we were wrong this whole time in how we approached it. Or it's embarrassing to be like, yeah, we tried all these strategies and they failed. I just feel like that's a really hard obstacle to sometimes overcome for people. And I just wonder what sort of role that plays when we look at people then being willing to make big changes, big systematic changes or big policy changes to sort of realize that how we've been doing it was wrong, or I thought it was wrong. Not everyone can do that.
I mean, the other thing is it's working as designed, and maybe it it isn't wrong to some people. And
True.
that's what we're coming up against, right? So one of the things that I say in my chapter 2 is that the war on drugs is working as designed.
So how do you
It
decipher that? Because I think like some people in some levels when we talk about harm reduction, I know like some counselors and some therapists and people that I work with who are like, man, I thought this all wrong. I my eyes are open now differently. But then you're saying there are people who are like, it's not going to work for them because to them, it's not seen as wrong. Like this is seen as this is going right.
Well, I think the cognitive dissonance has only started to emerge among people when people in power, and in particular, when white communities who chose to use drugs that were criminalized started bearing the brunt and experiencing the consequences that we were all very comfortable with poor and disposable whites encountering, but also communities of color and immigrant and migrant communities experiencing, right? You think about some of the broader rhetorical shifts, even just in the past 15, 20 years, in thinking through marijuana policy, thinking through psychedelic policy, and thinking through more health-based approaches towards opioid use and the overdose crisis. And what were the dramatic shifts that happened? They were led by white people. And they were led by relatively privileged white people who realized that some of the drugs that they liked to use were now inaccessible and they faced criminalization and incarceration for, and that they had trouble getting access to. And now we're bearing the brunt of a system that was designed to protect them from these drugs, but they wanted to use these drugs. And now they were dealing with the consequences. And so that's when we started to see some of these reforms moving forward. I work at an organization, the Drug Policy Alliance, where some of our biggest early wins were around marijuana policy reform. And logically, actually, when you think about reducing racial disparities in the criminal legal system in terms of arrests and incarceration and the collateral consequences of being in contact with the criminal legal system, we absolutely know that minoritized communities bear the biggest brunt of our drug laws. But, one of the reasons why marijuana was so integral to address first and continues to be such a big part of national efforts to chip away and try to end the drug war is that, and I think I mentioned this in the book, that, 90%, 80 to 90% of all arrests that happen in every year for drug related offenses are for possession alone, right? Quantities that the user themselves had just for their personal use. And of those 80% or so of arrests, a third of those are still due to marijuana. And so decriminalizing, medicalizing, and then allowing adult use access was a way to take the teeth out of the drug war, because by taking out this one drug that was the driver for so many arrests, particularly among communities of color, but also impacting access for white communities who may want medical access or recreational use, it was kind of a really important place to start and remains a really important place for us to do this work. And then now you see the move towards, psychedelic policy reform and medicalization. And many of the biggest advocates say that it's medicinal. They want it for PTSD. They want it for, a variety of other kinds of like intractable depression and things like that. And again, we have to acknowledge that for some people, perhaps they don't realize that it's working as designed, but they are saying that it's not giving me access, or it's potentially now making me face consequences that I don't want to. I still will never forget the 2015 headline in the New York Times with the headline was, "In overdose crisis, in opioid crisis, white families calling for a gentler war on drugs." And so we have to think about how even when communities are challenging the drug war, many people are just looking for carve outs to exceptionalize themselves while continuing to keep the system in place for others. And who are those others that people are still comfortable with having to bear the brunt or deal with the ramifications? Whereas, like, who's looking for carve outs for themselves and their loved ones?
Yeah, and I remember I've hosted a harm reduction roundtable or panel a couple times, and I know a colleague and friend of mine who uh, bluntly will say, well, what changed? What's happened that's so different now? And he said, white kids in suburbs started dying, and that's finally got different attention, or different people wanting different things. So, it seems like part of it is, bit by bit trying to make the changes. How does someone like yourself, when realizing those systems that are kind of going against you, or the people that this is working by design, I guess really, how do you keep on with knowing that that's sort of what's there and what you have to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, I still think there is, I mean, I'm not saying that I feel hopeless about change. I'm just saying that, we have to be frank that the war on drugs is unfolding as it was designed, right? And then there are plenty of people who think that it's working just fine and don't question it until it affects themselves or their loved ones. But what I would say is that, I often think about opposition to, or like investment in preserving the drug war, and who might be committed to those kinds of things, and classifying, where are those arguments coming from? And I think for some people, it's emotional. It's about morality. It's about having this idea of right and wrong and good and bad, and meeting those clear lines in the sand, and believing that, like, we need laws, we need punishments, we need, certain drugs are bad. They're just worse for you. Certain things are just worse for you than others. And some of those beliefs and values can be challenged, sometimes with information, right? Like helping people understand, well, the legal drug that's most easily accessible in this country, that's used most widely by most people in the United States, alcohol, is actually a known neurotoxin, right? That's been associated with hundreds of kinds of cancers and various health issues. And it's the most readily available one. And it's the one that advertises on TV, and it's the one where we see billboards every day. And yet other drugs actually have lower risk of, forming dependence, in terms of like health effects and psychoactive effects and like all of those kinds of things. I think, first of all, we need to identify where people are coming from, and then thinking through, like, is it an educational deficit or an informational deficit? Are there ways that we can offer more information? Is it an emotional or moral disconnect that we have to kind of explore with a person? And then, like, how do we appeal to those same heartstrings, but in a way that can kind of compel people to think differently, right? So, thinking about narratives about how people change, and like having compassion for how people change, and understanding that like punishment isn't always a pathway to change, and that punishment and change often don't happen in like a linear kind of way. I think that one of the important parts of kind of helping people deconstruct it is to find those different touch points and where they are. For some people, the economic argument is really important for, and so understanding how expensive it is and how much cheaper it is to provide services in the community. And for others, it's about humanizing the face of what we're talking about. So yeah, there's a lot of factors.
Yeah, I feel like those are one-on-one smaller conversations. Those tend to have, to figure out that strategy for this person in front of me, or the person who, maybe they don't know something, so I'm going to use education with it. Maybe it's some emotional piece tied into it, and focus on that. That gets challenging as the circle or the group of people gets larger, to sort of have that effect on it. So I really appreciate the need to call out that stuff, though, and be, blunt and straight with. And when you said unfolding by design, I feel like that could be a whole nother book highlighting, a point that we want to hopefully get to, where we see more of how it is unfolding, and the design of it is not what it was when it started. There's a part about your book that I was really glad you talked about it with treatment because I'm a counselor, I'm a therapist, I'm a treatment provider, and I knew when I learned about harm reduction, which wasn't until 17 years after already starting counseling. So I went this whole time in my career, never learned about it in school, never took a course on it. I worked in various, places where that those words weren't mentioned. It was a lot of abstinence based. It was a lot of treatment starts on this date, it ends on this date for everyone versus, maybe it takes a little bit longer for someone, or maybe
Mhm.
it continues after this. And then when I got introduced to harm reduction, by a friend who gave me Undoing Drugs, and I read that, as a therapist, it resonated with a lot of stuff that I believed about therapy, about like counseling, creating a safe space and how important some of those things are. And I was thinking, like, there are a lot of things that we were doing that wasn't like that. Like, this was not good stuff. So I say that because part of your book does dive into treatment, and you even talk about like treatment trauma. And I'm kind of want to know your input on it because we're doing a better job of trauma informed care. We're doing a better job of asking about it. But to be honest, we we ask people often, hey, have you ever gotten treatment before? Have you ever gone and gotten help somewhere else? And we kind of take down like, when was that? But we really don't ask them like, well, how was that for you? Or like, how was the treatment that you received? Because I'll tell you, there's a lot of people that I've counseled and I know that have come into our programs who the treatment they've gotten by the staff or the programs that they've been in to get better at times has caused more harm. And that just makes me not feel good just thinking about that. But you do talk about that treatment trauma, and I feel like that's a topic we don't bring up that much at all. Like, we don't have conversations around that or really inquire with people about it. So anything you can say about, that whole piece of it, or should we do more asking about people where, hey, when you went to this treatment program, how was it? How were you treated? Like, what was that like for you? Versus checking off a box of, okay, I got the dates in, or you completed it. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, first of all, treatment trauma is not my term. It was a term brought out by Andrew Tatarsky, a harm
Yep.
reduction psychotherapy pioneer who was a mentor of mine early on in my
Oh,
career.
you're so lucky. I just met him at a conference a couple months ago, and I read his book and I was so familiar with his work. And I was like, oh my gosh, he's here like talking.
Yeah.
So that's great that you've had that connection with him.
Yeah. So he talks about this concept. And I would say that, one of the problems and one of the reasons why I think we don't talk about it enough in treatment settings is because your success in treatment is because of what you do, not because of what the treatment provider does, but also your tough circumstances in treatment or your struggles in treatment or the challenges you encountered in treatment are also pitched as your fault, right? We kind of already, in how many of us were trained in substance use treatment, were trained to see our clients as manipulative, ungrateful, involuntary, um, trying to lie to protect themselves, many of whom would not be motivated, who don't want to be there, and who are going to try to get over on you. And
Resistant, non-compliant.
yes,
They're just not ready.
yes. And so when someone has a negative experience in treatment, we often say it's because not because of the treatment program, but because the person wasn't ready, because they were being resistant, because they wanted exceptionalized care or treatment, because they thought they were different, because they wanted to get away with something or get over. And so I would say that part of the reason why we don't ask these questions is because the way that traditional treatment settings have always been framed and many treatment settings still operate is that the providers are benevolent. The providers are providing the same care to everyone. They treat everyone the same. Everyone's expected to hold themselves accountable to the same rules and expectations and norms. And if someone does not succeed in treatment, air quotes around succeed, or if someone has an adverse experience, it's because they don't want to get with the program and they weren't ready.
Yeah, and I think that starts even, you ask people, why you came into treatment. After a while, you just hear the same response that you think is people saying what they're saying because they believe that that's what you want to hear, or they're not going to get admitted. So I often think, like, out of all the people I've worked with in some of these programs, oh, like, why are you seeking treatment? They think their answer has to be, well, I want to stop all my substance use. I want to stop all my drinking. If I say I want to use less, or I don't want to stop at all, but I want to, use maybe with safer methods, am I even going to be allowed? Am I going to be,
Yeah.
rejected? And I think about that because I really believe if we create that space for someone to really say why they are seeking services, why they are coming, I think we would do better with actually outcomes. Like if we matched it to what they really wanted, it'd be a lot better than if we're saying, well, here's what we want them to do. And then, like, hopefully we get that way. I was thinking about this young individual I was working with. He was 20 years old, and when I was working with him, he had 23 documented overdoses.
Oh.
And I know when I saw him in one treatment program and I saw him in another one. And, both of his, why are you coming here is I want to stop using. I started thinking about this when I got introduced into harm reductions. I wonder if a part of him would have just wanted to say, I just don't want to overdose anymore. It may not be stop using, but, and I think a lot of people would say, well, don't use, then you won't overdose. But for him, if his goal wasn't to overdose or to use safer, or to maybe have, naloxone to help with prevention versus people finding him, because he never had that at the time. People just found him, thankfully, and were able to help. So that makes me think, if at a time he could have said what it was that he did really want, or if other people could say what they really want, I think we could help them and serve them better than having I don't think all the hundreds of people all at the same time were like, I want to stop. Like, how was there no difference in why are you here?
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing is like, maybe he had no substance related goal and he just wanted someone to talk to.
Yeah.
And maybe he wanted to meet other like-minded people who could understand where he was coming from. Maybe he needed a place to be for a couple hours every day where he could focus on himself. Maybe he wanted to get started on an antidepressant. Maybe he wanted to get started on an anti-anxiety medicine. Maybe he was ready to start talking about some of his trauma. Maybe, like the goal was to get help, but like maybe the substance, like maybe he didn't see the substance as like the thing that like needed to be at the forefront of the conversation, because the most salient thing concerning him was loneliness, isolation, conflict with his parents, fear about, did I catch HIV the last time I injected? Can I talk to someone about, getting an HIV test and sitting with me until I get the results back? Like, there are so many things that people are motivated for. And oftentimes when they come and seek help, they just want a human connection. And we are so quick to right away just be like, well, clearly it's a substance related issue. Like, we need to jump on that first, without really realizing like we need to like build rapport. You're here now. Do you want to talk for the next hour? When can you come back again and meet with me? What do you want to talk about today? What's on your mind? What's worrying you? What's concerning you? And in what way do you think I could be helpful to you? Do you think I could make that call for that referral for you? Do you want someone to escort you to that appointment? Do you need to know where you can go and where you qualify for an intake? Like, all of those kinds of questions should be also part of the conversation.
Yeah, I feel like it opens up so many more possibilities. It opens up so many more things to look at versus like a narrow tunnel vision of, this one thing that we often say is, we'll just stop using or stop drinking, stop gambling. This is, if you just do that, everything else will get better, versus maybe we need to highlight a lot of other things that this person is really wanting, but they feel like they can't say. I think there's a fear of, if I tell them really what I want or what I don't want to do, like, can I even stay here? Can I? And now I work at places where you don't get kicked out for using, or you can tell me, well, I'm still doing this, but I just want to cut back a little bit, and it's like, that's great. And sometimes I can tell they're sort of surprised at my response when
Mm.
it's not the typical, well, it's not ready, until they want to stop entirely. I just don't think they're ready yet, or they're resistant, or anything like that. So I do appreciate, the part on that you touch on with treatment, because I think that's a big area that we need to look at too, as helping professionals.
Yeah. And the other thing is that we have to acknowledge, like, there is also a time and a place for detox in our continuum of care. No harm reductionist will ever tell you we don't need detox in the world. We don't need inpatient. We don't need residential. We don't need outpatient. No harm reductionist will ever say we don't need those things. A harm reductionist will tell you we need those things. And it's great that people can work towards abstinence in those places or be drug specific in those places. But like, also, 90% of people with addictions are never going to walk in the door of any of these places. And then where do they go? And the other thing is that when they do finally get the nerve to walk in, when their insurance is paying for it, when their life finally fits treatment into it, what are we doing to keep them there rather than kicking them out or making it hard for them to stay? Because as providers, we should be grateful every time a client shows up, because it means that they're motivated for something and they're getting something out of it. Because every day you wake up and show up to treatment, or every day you stay in a treatment program without leaving AMA or whatever, is the day that you're choosing something that we have to offer. And so, how do we continue to build on that rapport and that motivation and that engagement, and like encourage retention in the journey and the process of like trust building, rapport building, and really getting on the same page about where it is that I can help and support you in your journey?
Yeah, because we say those messages differently with other things. Like, I have type 1 diabetes, and I always realize, like, whenever I've been going to my doctor for several years, same doctors for a long time, but every time I go back, they're not ever like disappointed that I'm back. They're never like, oh, well, look who's back, or like, every time I come back, it's like, it's a good thing. It's praised, it's recognized, it's like, this is care, this is what you need, and we're glad you're here. Like, that's not how it's always treated with substance use. There's the revolving door, or the, oh, here they're back, maybe this
Frequent.
time it'll work. Like, that's, we don't talk that way about other, you know issues. We
Yeah,
praise it.
we claim we want everyone in treatment, right? My biggest opponents, or the people who challenge me the most or are challenged by harm reduction the most, are like, what about treatment, guys? What about treatment? You're not talking about treatment enough, Sheila. And then what do we do when people show up to treatment after a couple of years of being out there and struggling, or, who decide to walk in the door, or who miss a couple appointments and then show up one day and we say, well, you were supposed to be here yesterday. Sorry, we already closed your case. Or, we're going to ramp up your level of care. Or, why did it take you so long to come back? Rather than, we're so glad you're here.
Or I've seen people say, well, what's going to be different this time? Like, yeah, and it's, I mean, that's what we got to find out. Or that's what we're gonna can't know that if we don't allow them back. There's already like an anticipation that it's going to be same old, when a lot happens. A lot goes on in between that time, but anticipating that here we go again is, I struggle with that, because I worry that that's where the lack of compassion, the lack of really understanding, you know, what the person goes through, or what they've gone through since they last were with us. That, for me, I've just made it a really important habit now. Like, whenever someone comes back under whatever condition is just be happy to see them, to let them know you're welcomed here. I
Yeah.
just think that that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I'm so excited to work on whatever with you right now, and understanding, like for some people, it's a cumulative process of treatment. Every time you come, you're going to get something a little bit different. You're going to be in a different place. You're going to be in a different place in your journey. And instead of seeing everything in the black and white, either you succeed or fail, and it's almost like you wipe the slate clean. Like every time you leave treatment or like get discharged or use and are released from treatment or whatever, that somehow like it nullifies that whole episode, as if that person still wasn't there for however many hours a day, however many weeks, however many months, like as if nothing happened during that time.
Yeah. I look at it as like the monopoly where they have to, you know, turn in all their properties and their houses. They got to go back to go. Everyone else gets to keep on moving, but we sort of that whole starting over or like nothing in between that time matters. Like all that stuff matters. I mean, that's life. There is no taking all that back and starting over from zero. Like this is a continuation of your journey. And I think as a provider, I used to think a long time ago I would be that person that they might make that change while they're with me or make
Mm.
that great, that difference. But realizing that, I'm fortunate to join alongside someone's journey as a counselor when that moment's there. But that might not be what I think it's going to be. It can be meaningful, but that might be the first time they tried. And or it could be the 10th time that someone has tried. Like it's not a conveyor belt of the same, well, you meet with me, now you're going to be good. Like that just doesn't work that way. And I'm more okay with that as I get older and do more of this practice, that when I'm on someone's journey, it's very different parts for everyone where you are. It's not the same.
Yeah. And I think, you're touching on something really important, right? Like people want to join treatment. People become clinicians and providers. I myself did because I wanted to help change people's lives. Like I wanted to be that person for people, right? I wanted to be that person. I wanted to be the helper. I wanted to be the fixer. I wanted to be the confidant. I wanted to be the coach and the witness on someone's journey. And unfortunately, those kinds of relatively pure motivations can get contaminated by our egos and by our expectations and by our judgments and by almost becoming so personally invested in these clearly defined ideas of success and failure that now I'm not only holding my client to those standards, I'm almost holding myself to those standards. And how it actually not only breeds feelings of failures among your clients, but then it can also lead you towards burnout because here you are feeling like, I thought I was going to save her, or I thought I could really help him because I had this very clearly defined idea of what saving or helping would look like. And we both of us fell short of that.
And I really like that I read a lot about that in harm reduction psychotherapy with talking about countertransference. And I really, really appreciate that piece because it's not one that is always brought up. But as a clinical supervisor, when I hear people talking about someone that they're working with, and I get a sense of this seems kind of like a part, like, well, when I did this is, and it's sort of like, wait a minute, there's a little like that sounds like a little bit countertransference there. Like when you went through your journey, and now you're kind of thinking that's what they need to go through. I've been more aware of that and more willing to have those conversations because it talks a lot about how that countertransference as a helping professional happens. And one of the quotes was how quickly that can derail someone's treatment. Like that,
Yeah.
that can really interfere with that. So one of the final thoughts before we get to like some closing things is and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong on this. You sort of, I got the sense of putting up a little yellow flag of caution when it comes to people identifying themselves as harm reductionists, or we do harm reduction because simply, and I don't want to say simply, but doing one thing doesn't necessarily make you a harm reductionist. But I get the sense that some people are using that language. A lot of money's being given now for doing some harm reduction, or a lot more That can look a little bit enticing if you're saying we do this or we offer this, but you can offer some things that reduce harm, but does that make you a harm reductionist? And I think that was very interesting. I've never heard someone speak on that, that there may need to be some caution for when people say those things are identified that way. Is that true, or is that meaningful? Is that follow line with what a harm reduction is? Was I Is that what it kind of seemed like, a caution flag or just something to pay attention to?
Yeah, because I do think that more so now than at any other point in our history, harm reduction is a term or a phrase or a concept that is more familiar to more people than ever at any other point before. It's not to say that it's like, a conversational topic in every household and that everyone's fully literate and familiar with what it means. But I will say that more so than ever, people know what harm reduction is. We have a president who used the term in a State of the Union address. We have federal allocations from several entities towards harm reduction programming, research, et cetera. We, naloxone, or the brand name product Narcan, is one that many people are familiar with. Increasingly, people understand what syringe service programs are, and folks in a city like New York City live in a city with 2 overdose prevention centers. So, as harm reduction becomes more familiarized to more people, largely due to our interventions and tools, right? Sterile equipment distribution, overdose reversal medication, and then also through overdose prevention centers. And as more money gets allocated towards programs that say that they're providing harm reduction services or, providing those kinds of trainings, one of the dangers is that we then become narrowly defined by our interventions, but rather than our broader, also philosophical underpinnings, that no one is disposable, that drug use in and of itself is not a morally reprehensible behavior, that abstinence is great, but it's not for everyone, that we live in a world with drugs and that we will never live in a world without drugs. This idea that people are deserving of care and support regardless of the behaviors that they engage in. All of these kinds of true foundational values and tenets undergird harm reduction. The desire to help and serve and be in community with the most marginalized among us. Because harm reduction has always had its roots in people with lived and living experience, being the providers, being the advocates, being the service delivery folks, and being the recipients of the services. So also the cautioning of the professionalization. I'll admit that I'm part of the professionalization of harm reduction, as someone who came into the field with a social work degree and now identifies as a harm reductionist. And so one of the things that I just want to caution people is that harm reduction is more than its tools. It's more than its interventions. It's more than simply tolerating or accepting non-abstinence. It's more than just saying, if this is where you're at, I'm okay, but I want you to stop one day. That's not harm reduction. Me saying that today I'm willing to work with you, but let's clean this. We can't keep working this way for 6 months. Those kinds of things. That's the kind of conversations I want to be able to have about just cautioning people from feeling like harm reduction is just very tangibly certain interventions, certain tools, or just a certain way of working with a person in a current moment.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that, because as you wrote about that and I was reading it, there were certain things that to me, I was like, this is where some people, well-intentioned, not well-intentioned, could be using it and saying they are, or calling it something, and it really isn't representing what it really means, or it's, well, I like this part and I'm going to use that to sort of for whatever benefit they see it as. But I found it very, I guess, encouraging to see that there is some caution to throw out there and pay attention to when it comes to now how many people, how many places. That term is being used a lot more, absolutely, and realizing that it can be used in a way that's not what it's meant to, or to fully represent what it means. And I think that's just, I was very impressed that you deciding to write about that?
Yeah. Well, it was a controversial decision, and it was one of those um decisions towards the end of the manuscript writing process where I had scattered all of those paragraphs and sections across the book in various sections. And I thought to myself, actually, Sheila, you know what? We need to bring them all in the same place. They belong together. They're part of a broader cautionary warning that I want to provide, but also like caveats that I want to provide. Because again, yes, like as someone who's working in the drug policy space right now, I am seeing a lot of things shifting. I'm hearing a lot of like um, people framing, for instance, alternatives to incarceration or community supervision, such as probation and parole, or mandated treatment or drug courts as harm reduction. And as long as they're complicit in a system that's still predominantly focused on punishment or the threat of punishment, with the ultimate outcome of abstinence or imposed change or forced change at the cost of someone's freedom and liberty and their ability to feed themselves and keep their children and have the dignity of being able to receive public assistance if they need that kind of support. Like, I need to pause and tell people, like, the criminal justice system, or as some people call it, I call it the criminal legal system, is in and of itself a system that harms people who use drugs and harms many, many communities, in particular, you know, racially and like ethnically minority communities as well, and low income communities of all races. And I wanted to be very clear that community supervision is not harm reduction. If anything, it casts a broader net, and it keeps people under even more surveillance in their own communities. And it actually holds them to an even tighter restriction, and often sets them up to so-called fail, because if they don't meet every single requirement of like every phone call, every session, every check-in with the PO, showing up and being apologetic at drug court enough to show that I'm sorry about that positive drug screen, and I guess I'll tolerate being stuck in the jail for the weekend as my penalty or my consequence. You know, like those kinds of things, that's not therapeutic. That's not a harm reduction approach. That's imposing harm. It's still using the strong arm of the law and punishment to offer some sort of punitive corrective to drug use, which again is not a moral issue.
Yeah, that's it. You did again where you just illustrate how that, you know, someone says this is harm reduction, but when you really kind of play that out and think about it, this is when you see it as it's not, because of all those things that occur. So you have a great ability to illustrate that, to see how these things play out, which is a very amazing skill of yours through your writing and through your talking. So I just want to give you a shout out, recognition for doing that. So we've talking a lot. I feel like we could talk about so many things, but for the sake of time and everything, when someone gets your book, or someone, you know, says, hey, read this book of hers, it's you'll maybe you won't like it, but you'll get something out of it, because it is geared towards people who might not, like you said, fully agree with like it's not necessarily for the people who are doing this stuff, because this is going to be in agreement with you. What is it that, for the person that's going to grab this book and read it, you know, your hope for it, or your goal is, like, how would you articulate what it is that by reading this you hope that this could be a policymaker, this could be someone that works in an incarcerated setting, this could be a parent of a loved one, this could be, I mean, the audience is wide. So knowing that, and how impactful all this stuff is, what would you say that your hope for someone that reads this walks away with, you know, what kind of takeaway, or what sort of, well, I hope they get what from reading the book?
Yeah. I hope at the very least, someone who reads my book walks away and says, I understand what harm reduction is and what harm reductionists are advocating for. And now I understand a little bit more about how the current systems that we have in place are operating, and some of maybe the gaps in the system. But again, I want to recognize that as a harm reductionist, I meet people where they're at every day. And so what at the very least, as I'm saying, right, like if I can just meet people at a place where they may not know anything about harm reduction, they may have some misunderstandings or they need some clarification, that I met that informational need, like to me, that's huge. Now, if it's someone who has been on the fence, who's really not put together all the pieces and now has been persuaded to see the benefits of harm reduction, I hope that it helps trigger conversations in their day-to-day life. I hope it's something that they start thinking about when they're reading the newspaper or watching a television program or a movie, or the next time they have a conversation with a loved one. If there's someone who live in a family where substance use is part of the climate, the conversation, the family dynamic, that maybe it gets them to examine kind of like, in what ways are we being served by our community? In what ways do we still need help and support? And what are the options that we could have to help ourselves and each other? I would love it if, people in the healthcare professions or going into supportive health fields, for instance, read this book and they think about, who are the future people that I might be serving, and in what ways can I have a harm reduction framework or understanding in when I work with these people in the future? I would love for people who are voters or who are civically minded to keep this in mind when they're, when it's election season, people who live in neighborhoods and communities, whether they're renters or owners, to think about, what's happening in my community, what's available in my community, what do my neighbors need, what do I need in my community, what should be accessible, what's hard to get here. And why is it that we don't have an X, Y, and Z type of program? If you're an elected official, to have this in the back of your mind when you're sitting down reading a piece of legislation or having a conversation with a constituent. If you're a journalist, maybe something about reading this impacting the kinds of stories you tell or how you tell certain stories. And then, if you are committed to getting involved in your community, maybe volunteering, dropping in, doing a coat drive for your local needle exchange, coming by and doing a pizza party for the participants at the OTP around your corner, making sure to come by with extra socks and doing a fundraiser on giving, on whatever it is, Giving Thursday, volunteering. I think that there are so many touch points for people at the, raising awareness is great for me. That's an outcome. That's success for me. I have a continuum of outcomes that I want to see: raising awareness, gaining sensitivity, gaining insight, feeling mobilized to support and help us. And, if nothing else, understanding enough that, like, if you can't get behind it, at least don't get in our way.
Yeah, I like that. I like that part at the end of not getting in the way, because that was I was reading this book, Compassionate Accountability, and part of it talked to sometimes like the best thing we can do for a person is being able to sit with them while they're in their pain or in their struggle. And sometimes it also means just getting out of their way, like not trying to give them a solution that we think is going to fix everything or solve anything. And sometimes the best thing we can do is to step aside, but also know that when there is like a need, we will be there, like that's not going away. So you did a great job like summarizing all of that and all the different takeaways that could be. So it's really incredible and valuable information, and can't thank you enough for writing the book. I had a lot of people who were like, are we going to read this? Are we going to talk about this? They tagged me on your LinkedIn when you posted about it, and it did not disappoint. A fast read, you told me it would take maybe 2 or 3 days, and I read it in 3 flights in a matter of 2 days. So it does draw you into just taking in knowledge and information in a very quick and informative way, and really straight to the point. So it's really incredible work. I can't say that enough.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was really important to me that it was short and accessible. I am a person with a PhD, so I do have to write in academic jargon all the time in peer-reviewed journals, following all these rules and norms around what academic writing looks like. And I told myself, if I'm going to write a book about harm reduction, I have to write it just for the everyday regular person who may not have a lot of time, who may not even really have much of a background, and who may not even be sure if they want to read this. And so I was thinking, like, how do I make a book that's like easy to read, makes me a person too, right? So of course I'm an expert. People know I'm an expert. People turn to me for a variety of things, but I wanted to write about it as a woman, as like a young woman who came of age in the 80s and 90s and was exposed to these different kinds of messages as, a burgeoning professional who thought I was doing good by getting a job at a treatment facility because I was told treatment helps and saves lives. As someone who was then disenchanted and still wanted to help, but needed to find a different pathway. And then eventually, moving on to a harm reduction program and having to deal with the discomfort that like maybe I was an agent of harm and like I need a lot. And that it's not as simple as walking into a harm reduction facility and knowing how to do harm reduction. I needed clinical supervision from a person like Andrew to really deprogram and reprogram in a different kind of way to be helpful. And so I wanted to make sure that people understood that I wasn't born a harm reductionist. And I don't expect you to be a harm reductionist when you open this book. And maybe you're not even going to be a harm reductionist when you finish the book. But I changed, people change. And I wanted to tell that story.
Yeah, it's amazing. It was very well written. It was the gap of all the things that we talk about with harm reduction, how you play through the tape. You go at length, a good length about, the whole background on war on drugs. And you dive into so many really important areas in a very quick and comprehensive way. So that was very well done in how you did it. So it's great. I can't wait for more people to read it. I've actually given out a few copies and you signed them for me. So that was fantastic. And I'm going to keep giving them out when I can. So I think audience members now listening to this, just even more reason for them to want to learn more. And I have confidence that out of all the things you've said they're the takeaways or meeting them where they're at, that someone's going to feel that when they read it, and even hearing you talking about it now as well.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the support. And folks don't see us on camera, but my book is propped up behind you on your desk there. I love it.
Yeah, that's when I'm on meetings, when I'm in sessions, work meetings, counseling sessions. That's kind of what people see behind me, and people start to, when they know me, they start to look and see what's what book is back there. So yeah, I'm a big supporter. So I really want to thank you for joining. We're going to have information for people to where they can get the book and find out more about what you do, but can't thank you enough for all the time you spent, connecting with me and joining and talking for as long as we did, because there was just a lot of enjoyable conversation that we had.
Yeah, it was absolutely my pleasure. I love talking about drugs and harm reduction.
Yeah. So, and your work can't thank you enough for all the work that you do and will continue to do, and do what we can to support it. So appreciate all that. And going forward, I'm sure there'll be continued conversations and dialogues happening.
Yeah, great.
All right. Thank you, everything. And thanks for joining us. And, really hope the audience learned something from you, and know that they will. And you'll hear more about where to find her book, and just keep looking out for what she is doing. So thank you again, Sheila.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Talking Addiction and Recovery with Andrew J. Schreier. We're so glad you've joined us and invite you to connect further with the show and these topics at www.andrewjschreier.com. That's AndrewJSchreier.com. You can also email us directly at talkingaddictionandrecovery@gmail.com and connect on social media, Instagram at Talking Addiction and Recovery, Facebook Talking Addiction and Recovery Podcast, and Twitter at TalkAR_podcast. To stay connected and never miss an episode, be sure to like, rate, and subscribe. Until next time, friends, let's keep talking addiction and recovery.